welcome back to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle. Well, Nina, how are you? Hi.
Hi. Thanks for asking, Kyle. I am recovering from COVID. I got the big Roro a few days ago. Actually, the start of February, I tested positive for COVID and I'm now in the process of recovering. I sadly did not recover fast, but I luckily did not have the worst of the worst symptoms. So thank you for asking, Kyle. And for those in the audience, yes, I was missing for a while because I got sick.
Yeah, so that's the reason why we weren't able to record and post an episode last week. It's because of that. First of all, I don't want anyone to think that I just generally just don't check up on Nina. I do. It's just, I haven't done it today. It was Nina's choice to bring up COVID. I was just genuinely curious as to how, Yeah, so anyway, for today's episode, we wanted to talk about historical reparations. But we recognize that we're not the best people to talk about some of these things, particularly Black History Month. But we wanted to bring it up a little bit while recognizing our limited capacities to really talk about the subject. So yeah, it is Black History Month. You will probably see and hear a lot of Western media talk about Black history for the month of February. And that's because, well, it's a more positive thing. It's not just about like, oh, racism was bad, racism was bad, slavery was bad, because everyone already knows about that.
I mean, that's not true, though. That's not true. A lot of people still argue for slavery and things like that. But for the most part, I hope the most majority of the world thinks that those things are bad.
Yeah, but, that's true. That's true. But Black History Month, if I'm not mistaken, is geared towards a more positive focus. Because if we're just talking about slavery, we're talking about slave owners because unfortunately, a lot of our records of who these slaves were is lost to history. Like we don't know their names anymore or who they were and stuff like that. But we do know that at least from the period, we do know the bad things that white slave owners did. So for Black History Month, there's a significant amount of effort to move away from discussions about white people and start talking about the actual contributions that were given by Black people. So Black History Month is less about how they were victimized. And actually, a lot of Black people say that we shouldn't see ourselves as victims, but let's talk about instead, our achievements over the past 400 years. Because for the past 400 years, that's almost half of a millennium already, Black people have been contributing to the development of the United States, but their contributions have been minimized by most white historians. And my personal favorite example is the fact that most of the infrastructure in Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States, was actually built by slaves. Yeah, so the White House, for example, you can call it the White House because it was built by Black people for white people. So apparently, and this is from whitehousehistory.org, nobody wanted to work on the building. So the Congress had appointed commissioners to, organize the construction of the White House. But the White House was having some problems being constructed because no one wanted to work on it. They initially planned to get Europeans to work on it, but no one wanted to do it. So that's when they got slaves to do it. It helped that Washington, D.C. was stuck between Virginia and Maryland, which were both slave states at the time. So it's like a huge amount of irony on one end that you saw a Black family moving into the White House with the Obamas, but also, and this is the perspective that Michelle Obama wanted to have on it, they said that their presence in the White House is more of a statement of the constant struggle of the Black community and their constant achievements that led to them being there. So it wasn't really focusing on the negative aspect. It was focusing on a more positive kind of thing. Another example for this is the U.S. Capitol building where the legislature is, the Congress is in. So there's a wing for the House of Representatives. There's a wing for the Senate. the Capitol building was where Democrats were arguing against giving Black people any rights in the 1860s when they were debating about the 14th Amendment. So you can probably watch movies like Lincoln, and you can see that was the Capitol building. That's where they were talking about like giving Black people the right to vote is not something that you want, because how can we recognize in law that Black people are just as human as white people when God made them less than human? So those kinds of lines are being brought out in the Capitol building. And in present day, modern Republican senators are trying to disenfranchise Black voters by blocking the expansion of voter registration laws, by imposing more restrictions on who can vote. And it was also, if you can remember, the US Capitol was attacked by right-wing terrorists last year, and many of those people who stormed the Capitol were white nationalists that were trying to defend Trump. So unfortunately, again, because of history and stuff, we don't know anymore who directly built these infrastructure projects. In The Invisibles, which is a book by Jesse Holland, they were arguing that it's not even possible to find out anymore who these builders were, because they never even bothered to record the names of the crew who worked on it. Because why would you? Like, at the time, they weren't considering these people as humans. So there wasn't any reason to list down the names and identities of the slaves that they got to work on the White House and the Capitol and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it's no secret the world we inhabit today is full of these inequalities, full of these really tragic stories. But as the Black community is trying to thrive, right, and doing their best to move away from those negative narratives, we have themes actually per month, or per year, I guess, for each Black History Month. This year, the theme is health and wellness. So it focuses more on not just mental health, but physical health and the struggles that the Black community goes through in the medical field, not just as people who are being treated, but people trying to be individuals who treat different diseases and the struggles that they face because of discrimination. I think one of the most famous cases would be like the HeLa cells. So if you don't know about that, basically a lot of the stem cell research that's going on right now regarding cancer cells was because they took what's her name again?
Henrietta Lacks. Kaya siya HeLa.
Yeah, Henrietta Lacks. They got one of her, I don't know where the cells were located, but they stole her cells, are using it to develop research. And up until now, there is no payment being made to the family. They are benefiting from basically the abuse that they did to her body, right? Like, some people would say I'm overreacting when I say it's abuse, but it's abuse because consent was not given when they took those cells, right? So this month focuses on the health struggles of the Black community. And again, as Kyle mentioned earlier, we don't have the most ascendancy to talk about these things, but we do have the platform, and we think that in our limited capacity, we do have the obligation to talk about these issues and, encourage our audience to read up more about these topics, to go to different Black content creators and give them the spotlight that they need, read up on these stories, read up on different books. I have a few suggestions, actually. If you want to learn about mental health and the Black community, there's this book I read recently called I'm Telling the Truth, But I'm Lying. It's a really good book. It's a memoir about a Nigerian American immigrant who is also someone who suffers from bipolar 2 disorder. So very close to my heart. Obviously, there are some parts I can't relate to, like the struggles of diagnoses, because like the Black community faces a lot of discrimination in that aspect. But still very informative. I really recommend it. Another book I'd recommend is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a known activist for the Black community, and this book is basically a call for international solidarity amongst different oppressed groups like the Black community and Palestinians. The Palestine-Israel conflict, I'm not going to touch that Pandora's box right now, but it does link a lot with the struggles of the Black community more than you would think, right? And it's interesting to find out about how those things happen through this book. And obviously, everyone's classical recommendation, To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a classic for a reason. I really recommend you read up on it. or watch the movie if you're not the reading type. But basically, I want you all to use this month to like give yourself more knowledge about the Black community. And for this episode in particular, I know that was a really long intro. Actually, it's more like a mixed discussion already at this point. Kyle and I have a lot of thoughts and feelings. But
Yeah.
basically, what we want to talk about in the debate sense, right, is the idea of reparations. Because I think a lot of what Kyle said, you can't contest it, right? Like, obviously, slavery, bad. Like, lack of consent, bad. Abusing the Black community, bad. But it's a question of what we do now and what we can do as the current generation that has to sort of know about these things and live with the, if you're white, you live with the benefits that your ancestors got by enslaving someone. Or if you're a person of color, you have to live with the consequences that, you know, like your past has brought upon you, because a lot of these problems are intergenerational, which we'll be discussing more thoroughly as we go on through this episode. But the idea of reparations is basically like giving someone what they are owed. And it sounds very simple in its logic. I think it should be simple. I just don't think it's as straightforward as a lot of people think it is, which is why we want to talk about it. But just know, while we are talking about Black History Month and the Black community, reparations is not unique to them. Our examples, however, will be about them. But just know that we have a lot of reparations in status quo already for different things, because our law basically encourages it and makes it a thing, right, Kyle?
Yeah, it's not just a thing. It's like it's a huge part of law already that like in the United States you have a lot of these claims against other people for like wrongful action, wrongful death, etc. Torts and stuff. Here in the Philippines we call it damages. Because like we obviously don't live in a vacuum as individuals. Like everything we do directly affects another person. And while we can't like go back in time and make it so that these things never happened, we try to compensate them in monetary forms. So like let's give them financial compensation for the harm that they incurred. But also there is something called symbolic reparation. So you can see it in Black History Month. So that is a form of symbolic reparation because like again, we don't know who built the White House anymore. Like we forget who they are. So the best that we can do is to give some sort of symbolic reparation that recognizes their contributions, even though their names might have been lost to history. So that's one kind of reparation that we have. And even here in the Philippines, we did have human rights violations victims during the martial law era. So when we're talking about reparations to those victims, we're not just going like, let's give them money, let's give their families money, but it's also like recognizing that historical wrongs have been committed and sort of educating people on those wrongs. And that takes the form of symbolic reparation, which is why a few years ago, when the dictator was buried in the libingan ng mga bayani, um, everyone was mad and there was a dissent from former Chief Justice Melu Sereno and current Justice Leonen. They were talking about symbolic justice, symbolic reparation, and how if we put this dictator in this cemetery, we sort of spit in the faces of the people that they victimized.
Name drop mo na, charot.
Yung mga Marcos. but okay, the reason why he was allowed to stay there was because even though we call it libingan ng mga bayani, it's not really there because like heroes sila. Okay, bayani, the term is bayani, which we can translate into hero, but in law it's actually reserved for people in the military, including presidents. So unless they were disqualified because of like dishonorable discharge or conviction of a crime or something, or they were impeached, then they are not allowed to be buried there. But since Ferdinand Marcos was not apparently dishonorably discharged from the military, even considering EDSA, right? You can say, and actually Carpio, Justice Carpio was saying that that was dishonorable discharge as the commander in chief of the military when he was removed through a revolution. Still, the Supreme Court was like, yeah, no, he qualifies. Since he qualifies, the president has the power to just determine who gets to stay there. So
Yeah,
it's
I mean
actually
that's
mostly
why
the darkness.
it's symbolic, right? That's why the main argument is about the symbolic aspect of it. Because if you're talking about like the technical parts, like they deserve to be there. But anyway, back to Black History Month. Sorry for the
Yeah,
tangent.
no, but like it's not just about those big things like Black History Month or martial law. It also really applies to everyday occurrences. Like the rule is if you commit a wrong and that wrong causes damage or injury to another person, you have to compensate that other person. So this isn't legal advice, but like let's say you own a business, right? Let's say, for example, you make bags. And in order to make bags, you need to have a supplier of leather. So let's say you took a bunch of orders for bags, they paid you already, but your leather supplier ghosts you. Like it just stopped replying to you, even though you already paid for this month's shipment of leather. So as a result, you couldn't make the bags. People want refunds, people cancel their orders, people say you're not a reliable seller, you get really bad reviews on Facebook Marketplace, those kinds of things. So in that case, the supplier needs to compensate you, the business owner, because as a result of their ghosting, you lost money because you didn't get what you paid for. You also lost profits because people asked for refunds, they canceled your orders. Your reputation also suffered, which might mean that you have less opportunities to sell in the future, or it might have cost you mental anguish and stuff like that. So the supplier needs to compensate you in the form of damages. So there are many different kinds of damages, like there's actual damages, compensatory damages, moral damages, stuff like that. And like all of these things, you talk about them for a while, but that's a general rule, right? Now, if like they directly harmed you, you need to be paid. You need to be paid. You need
Has
to be
that ever happened
compensated.
to you? Like, have you ever been in a situation where you had to be compensated or given reparations?
I mean, no, kasi usually, right? If you're a very young person, you don't really enter into these very formal contracts with strangers.
Yeah.
So usually in order to enforce this, you ask, oh, could you compensate me for this? And usually they do. Because we're both just small time. But like if we're talking about like big people, like actual corporations and stuff, there is a chance that you will have to go to court to enforce this obligation. So this whole field of law that's just dedicated to that. But whenever you think about a time when you feel like a wrong was committed against you and you feel like you had to spend money because of that, I think that you can probably tell yourself that maybe there's a case here. Maybe I should contact a lawyer if you really feel that way about it. So I can't tell
Again,
you
this is
to.
not legal
It's not legal
advice.
advice, right? But I was thinking about like, what if because of like an abusive partner or something, and you had to get therapy because of how badly you were treated? Like, can you sue your abusive ex-partner for the costs of the therapy that you needed to get? Because therapy is very expensive, no? And I even mentioned in a status recently that I had to get some help from a child psychologist, partly because I was, just a little dickhead, but also because like some of my teachers are like, yeah, let's isolate this person. It actually damaged a big part of my psyche. So I was thinking like, should I get a lawyer? Should I get a lawyer?
I think you
Um
probably should. Like, why not? Like sue. I mean, let's be very American and just sue everyone, sue everything. Try to get some money out of the situations you got. Anyway, given all those things about reparations, and now that we see that it's something that takes place in everyday life, whether you're in a corporate field of life or if it's about your personal life or mental health, even with Kyle's example about abusive relationships, there can be arguments made about historical wrongs and why reparations should be there. And for this episode, we want to run you through exactly how to make these arguments, whether you're making them for yourself or making them for other people. And typically, there are 3 steps to doing this. The first step is to point out that a historical wrong has taken place. The second thing you do is point out that even if there is a wrong, there is an ongoing harm that is still affecting you. And the third step is to talk about the reparative action, or what you want in return that is commensurate or equal to the damages that have been caused on you. And I guess I'm going to take it from here. Step one, right, is about pointing out the historical wrong. So injustices have been happening against entire groups of people for as long as, time immemorial, for as long as society has had the ability to go to different countries and basically enslave different civilizations. So for the Black community, there's slavery, colonialism, land grabbing, even segregation, like Jim Crow laws. I'm kind of embarrassed about this, Kyle, because I've only recently learned about Jim Crow laws. Like, I know segregation was a thing, but I didn't know how bad it was. Like, in high school, were you taught these things?
No, we didn't
Yeah,
have any of that actually.
yeah,
Like
we didn't either.
our education in history was really really bad. Like we did have this concept of like Western history, Eastern history, but we never really brought it to the modern day. Like yung Western history education namin was about like Shakespeare and Henry the
Typical.
Eighth and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
like we never go into like let's talk about slavery. Like if it's an uncomfortable topic, we just skip over it. Like slavery, let's skip over that. Martial law, let's skip over that. So this is not a unique experience to me in San Beda, but like I remember I was talking to some of my friends about that, how we were taught martial law. Yung sa akin, it was just like, oh, we were not disciplined and stuff like that. So it's like martial law apologia. So they go like, yeah, human rights abuses. But ang kulit kasi ng mga bata noon eh. Like,
Oh my God, that's horrible. I mean,
yeah,
we didn't talk so much about oppression in the West, but we did talk a lot about martial law. But I'm from Saint School, so we're like an anomaly there. But I think
yeah,
it's a common experience for Filipino schools that we don't talk about Western struggles so much, which can be a pro or con, right? If you're because it's a good thing that we're not focusing so much on our colonizer and focusing more on ourselves. At least that's the case for Saint School, where we talked more about our own history.
yeah. We weren't focusing on anything. We were just like, yeah, let's skip this. It's uncomfortable. Let's just list down things that they did, things that were sort of controversial, I guess. Let's move on. It was just like, what do these controversies mean? So another one of my friends, different school naman, it was like a table of pros and cons for martial law, but then it wasn't giving you like the answer, right?
What?
Because like you saw that there was like a list of
Why would
infrastructure
you write
projects on the left
pros?
hand side. On the left hand side, you're like infrastructure projects of Marcos. So it's like a long list, right? And then on the right hand side, it was just like one or two lines of human rights abuses. Moving on. So like visually, it seems like Marcos has done more good than harm. And I feel like a lot of people took that from it. Like, they stole some money, they committed human rights violations. But see, we have the Long Center, we have the Film Center and stuff.
Yeah, but I don't want to take away from like the discussion of Black History Month, because I think we talk a little bit too much about martial law. But I mean, it's election season, very important. But yeah, so I brought that up because I realized like I didn't get a lot of education about Black history. Which I think we should, right? I think that's debatable though. Do you think like Filipinos should learn about the struggles of other communities when we don't even have the capacity to learn about our own struggles sometimes?
I think that we should learn from as many sources as we can. Right? So that will definitely include Black history. It should, because like a lot of these revolutions you can learn from each other's revolutions, and actually we can use the context from these other places and use it to inform us of our own situation. And that happens a lot. Like yesterday I found out that Sun Yat-sen, who is the father of Taiwan, he was actually inspired by Rizal's works. So I didn't know that. Like apparently Jose Rizal is Mr. Worldwide. He did inspire a lot of these different world leaders. Um like the EDS revolution was studied by a lot of other people as well, from different countries, and it inspired them to make their own peaceful revolutions. Um, the Philippine Revolution, against Spain, was partly a result of people going to the West and learning about the French Revolution, and it made them realize that we should, yeah, we're pretty messed up in the homeland. Let's do a revolution, or let's fight against our oppression, right? So I think that it's very important for us to understand Black history as well in the Philippines. So that it might include like Jim Crow laws, it might include like um, education about the 13th Amendment, racial segregation, that those kinds of things. And it's not just for I know for Black history. Like we can also talk about Cambodia and stuff. Like in second year high school, we talked about Asian history. Maybe that's where we can talk about the situation in Cambodia, right? So I feel
Mm.
like this is a completely different topic from historical reparations, but I think that even though in those countries they probably have a duty to make symbolic reparations and financial reparations, in other countries there is also a benefit to learning about those historical wrongs committed in other places.
Yeah, so that brings us back to step one, right? The historical wrongs and pointing them out, just so you can have a clearer picture of what oppressions people are going through. Because it might not be happening anymore. Like slavery might not be as widespread as it used to be. Jim Crow laws stopped in 1968. But for 100 years, right, from the post-Civil War era around 1865 to 1968, like they were marginalized individuals just because of the color of their skin. And up until now, obviously, that 100-year advantage that the white people had, it still plays a role to what's happening today, like the amount of housing that goes to the Black community or the opportunities that they're given, even like the amount of money that they're able to earn in their entire lifetime has been dictated because the whites had a 100-year like head start over them. Besides Jim Crow laws, you can also see different massacres that have happened before. Like the famous one is the Tulsa Massacre. What was that movie? I don't know if we watched this together, Kyle, but there's a movie that depicted the Tulsa Massacre.
It wasn't a movie. First of all, yes, we watched it together. Second, it wasn't a movie. It was the Watchmen series. I think the
Yeah.
first episode was the Tulsa Massacre.
Yeah. But like that show, right? It showed it wasn't really about racism. Oh, actually it is. It's like
It
a
was
metaphor.
like
Yeah, it
super.
is literally a metaphor for racism. But it's not it's not very in your face about it if you're not like tuned in for it. But if you're a debater and you have like a knack to spotting metaphors, and I really think The Watchmen is also a really good series to watch. It's obviously like very debatable as well, like a lot of the philosophies there. But it's I think it's a fun thing to watch also if you just wanna like see racism and how it plays a role whether in the past or in the present.
I actually disagree with you. I because on the point that it was kind of subtle, I think it wasn't super subtle. Like in
No,
the
I mean
first
like
part,
I'm talking to about like the dumb Americans, like the dumb people who will really reject any political implications that a show has. Like some people argue like, oh, don't make the Watchmen political. It was never political. It's just a bunch of superheroes. So obviously they're wrong, right? I'm
yeah,
just
super wrong.
yeah, they're super wrong. But I don't agree that it is subtle. I'm saying that it's subtle if you are not tuned in for it at all. Like
Yeah, but that was that series was quite amusing for me because like they're so cheeky about it sometimes. Like they don't say, "Ha, this is a joke about how racism is damaging," but they go like in the first episode, like there was someone who was teaching how to make like omelets. And one of the first things that they go like is you have to separate the whites from the yolks. I was like, what? What did you say?
yeah, like for a lot of people that's gonna fly over their heads, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
But there are other parts that are just it's impossible for it to fly over your head. Like one of the characters hides a KKK costume, a hood in their closet, right? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's that.
So
I don't want to spoil. I don't want to spoil it. I really just think people should watch it. Like, if you're not into the classics, then watch modern media about the Black lives struggles. I think like people have been really creative these past few years, and these shows, as much as they are uncomfortable, they're also very entertaining. Which is also debatable.
oh
Like,
man, Black Klansman.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Did we watch that together, Black Klansman?
I think we did, or we watched it separately, but I do remember watching it.
Yeah, so Black Klansman is this hilarious. I'm not mansplaining to you something that we watched already. It's for the audience. I need to make that distinction sometimes. Black Klansman, for people who haven't watched it, it's this sort of dark comedy movie um about about a real life story where a black guy who is in the police infiltrated the KKK by pretending to be a white supremacist as well. It was
Mostly on the
really funny. Yeah.
phone.
Yeah, mostly on the phone. I mean, for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Obama put it in his top X number of movies for that year. That's how
Maybe
like
that's why we watched it. I feel like we had I remember binging some of Obama's recommendations. I think like we did some together.
yeah, every year Obama gives like recommendations for like music, movies, and stuff like that. And I was like, that's cute. That's cute. Um,
Anyway,
anyway, so that's the first step, right? That's the first step. Talk about the historical wrong. The second step is, as you mentioned, try to discuss how the harms that were caused by the historical wrong cascades into the present day. So this is actually something that you can see in our current laws, because like we mentioned earlier, sometimes wrongful actions don't exist in a vacuum. They turn into something else. They sort of metastasize and affect other aspects of your life. So for example, let's say that you're a factory worker or a seaman, and then you get into a car accident, and because of that car accident you become paralyzed, and so you can't work in your job as a manual laborer anymore. So the person who caused the accident has to pay you for the immediate harm, which is the medical cost, right? But they also have to pay you for the consequential damages or the consequential harms, which happen as a consequence of that wrongful act. So it would be something like lost income, or because your action made someone lose their job. So that's sort of a principled comparison, or like an intuition pump for historical reparations. You can't just pay for the immediate stuff, right? So you can't just be satisfied with giving like a former slave some money, especially since they're dead already, right? A lot of them, most of them have already died, so we can't really directly pay them. But the consequences exist even today. So slavery was bad in and of itself, but millions were deprived of land that continued throughout generations. Capturing and torturing human rights defenders is already harmful, but it also means years where their children couldn't grow up without their parents, right? So, why do and since you were talking about Jim Crow laws earlier, why do ghettos have a lot of black people? It's because historically, places where people lived were demolished to make way for government construction projects. And black people, since they were statistically poorer because slavery prevented their great grandparents from amassing and passing down wealth, and also probably because racists didn't want to employ them, they weren't able to afford fancy new housing, right? So while white people were also evicted, they had the resources to buy new housing in fancy areas. Black people had no choice but to gather together in enclaves known as ghettos now. So look, if you think about Ben Shapiro will insist that there's no such thing as systemic racism today because slavery is illegal. Because look, it's illegal to be racist, so the laws aren't racist, and therefore there's no such thing as systemic racism.
Ew, why did you have to do it in their voice? Jesus.
Ben Shapiro insists that there's no such thing as systemic racism because ostensibly, right, at first glance, laws aren't racist. But racial inequalities are a result of racist systems anyway. Like, so it's absolutely untrue what Ben is saying because private activity, because what he's arguing is racial inequalities are a result of racist people, private individuals, not like government actions or laws, right? But those private acts of racism in a lot of cases could not have happened, and it could not have succeeded in segregating people on racial lines unless there were also governmental policies that were designed to ensure that segregation. So I really appreciate my law education because when we were talking about the Bill of Rights in first year, we were recommended a chapter from a book by Rothstein called The Color of Law. It's a very recent book. It's from 2017. And Rothstein was arguing about how government policies, even those that were ostensibly neutral on the matter of race, served to further racial inequality. And that includes the stuff about ghettos. So there's no law saying that the police, for example, should over police black neighborhoods. But because of social conditions like poverty, government abandonment, that push many young people, young black people to crime, they do end up getting over policed. Here in the Philippines, naman, for example, human rights violations happened in the past. Money was stolen by the government in the past. We're still paying for that today, right? Like they need to pay for a huge amount of debt that was incurred by the Marcoses, specifically Ferdinand Marcos. But let's not isolate things because they were all basically complicit in that because we were basically paying for Imelda's shoes, for example. And we're still paying for it today. How do you pay back a debt? If you're the government, it is by increasing taxes so that you can gain more revenue to pay off that debt, right? So we are still literally paying for it today. We're still suffering the consequences of that today. So if you don't have justice in those cases, you can't move on. So for Black Lives Matter, their slogan is "No justice, no peace." The other day, Lenny was on record saying that we cannot unify unless you first address past wrongs. No justice, no peace. We say no justice, no unity naman. And that's something that I feel like you really need to do as a debater. You will need to explain why the harm is ongoing. You need to spend time in it because I think this is what's considered a hard sell for many people, right? Like the past is in the past now, right? They would say that. So your job is to say that the present is built on the past. I don't think you have to be very absolutist about it. So you don't necessarily have to say that everything is dictated by that, but you can say that a huge part of it is affected by things that happened in the past.
Yeah, you know how a lot of people would say that they're not against reparations, they're just against like the amount that we're giving because it seems overkill. I think those people are blind to like the cascading effect that past wrongs have to what's going on today. Like everything's a butterfly effect, right? Like if you're into those conspiracy theories, especially if you're like a white supremacist and you're into conspiracy theories, it's really strange to me that you can be into conspiracy theories but not agree with the sentiment that what happened 100 years ago still affects someone today, right? It makes like I don't know how people can have that kind of dissonance with their logic. But anyway, so that's step 2. Kyle explained wonderfully that you need to point out that harms are still ongoing. I guess the last step for me is the hardest one, right? It's talking about the reparative action itself. Because most times, a lot of people will agree that a wrong was done, right? And you need to make up for it. They'll just disagree on how much do we give back? In what form do we give back, right? When do we know if it's proportionate? When do we know when it's commensurate? And where do we go from here? Those are usually the common questions. So I've done some research, and there are usually just 5 things that the Black community asks for, right? In terms of really getting reparations in the form that they want to equalize the playing field. Of course, it's not going to solve everything, but it will elevate their status a little bit and give them a fighting chance against systemic problems, systemic racism, white supremacy, etc. The first one is obviously the very basic understanding of reparations, which is individual payments for descendants of enslaved Black Americans. So the US government owes a lot of wages as well as damages to the people it helped enslaved and the people it enslaved itself in building its own infrastructure, as Kyle mentioned. And according to the Federal Reserve, especially back in 2016, white family get an average family wealth of $171,000 compared to Black and Hispanic families, which have around 17,000 to 20,000 respectively, right? So, like, just look at that gap. It's literally $100,000 difference in the family wealth that the average families in the United States have just because of the color of their skin. So individual payments need to be made to catch up to those white numbers. That's the first, right? And of course, this is changing. And Ben Shapiro would say, like, oh, we see a lot of Black successful people, and they're proof that the playing field is not that unfair anymore. But those are anomalies. Like, Black individuals who manage to succeed despite adversity, they are the exception more than the rule. And we should not be complacent just because a few individuals manage to dig themselves out, because it shouldn't be that hard in the first place. But it is hard for a lot of people. It is hard for a lot of Black individuals. So we should make it so that their life setting, if this were a video game, is set a little bit less in difficulty, because it's really unfair the amount of struggle they have to go through just to live their life and not die on a day-to-day basis on the hands of the police and etc. So the second thing that the Black community is asking for is college tuition for 2-year or 4-year colleges and universities for descendants of enslaved Black Americans. So a lot of the advantages of the white community is because Black individuals were not allowed to go to school for a lot of their lives, or like post-Civil War, during their enslavement, even until like the 90s, right? A lot of people were still being rejected by these big universities that were the go-to universities in America. So they're asking that, the least you can do is give the descendants free tuition so that they can experience something that their ancestors were never able to. And for me, I think that's fair. Like, do you think that's a little bit too much? Because some people, like, after the first point, like 2 to 5, since I did mention there are 5 things that the Black community is asking for, like, a lot of them are, kind of controversial already. Like, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think like that makes sense naman, right? Because the main basis for that is the ancestors were deprived of education, and that caused some damages. We need to repair that by giving that education. So in a sense, it's like we can't really estimate how much was lost, or how much in terms of money was not given or was not acquired as a result of not getting education. So in order to remedy that, let's just give education. So I think that's like I think what will be common in these next 4 points is that we can't really estimate the financial cost of slavery on these families. So let's just approximate it by doing certain things. And I feel like education is a really great way to start. And like I don't think it should be that controversial, because we are basically saying like, let's just give education to people. I suppose that it will be controversial because people would say that, oh, the only reason why you're in this university is because you're Black and not because of your own merit. But I don't think that that's necessarily true, because even in these affirmative action situations, you can't just claim I'm Black, let me into Harvard, right? You also need to be competitive even as a Black person. Like, it's still a competitive system even if you're from a minority group, right?
Yeah. So actually that brings me perfectly to the third point, because the third point is also still about education. It's about student loan forgiveness. And they say that if you were a descendant of an enslaved Black American, your student loan should be forgiven, because it's not enough that you're able to go to school. You should be able to go to school for free, because the strain on your family to get you through college is a lot more than the strain it is for a like white individual. So this is where I kind of understand the controversy. There's a controversy here about, we're already giving you money. Why are we also giving you extra money in the form of student loan forgiveness? So what are your thoughts on that one?
Student loan forgiveness, I feel it's a bit more removed from the idea that, because earlier the logic was that your ancestors were deprived of education. Let me, subsidize your education this time. I feel like that is sort of an extension of that. Like, let's say that you can already go to school. Let me pay for the expenses there, especially if you loan. So it's not really targeting all Black people. It's targeting those Black people who are more vulnerable compared to others. And their vulnerability is evidenced by the fact that they have student loans. Because the bigger your loan is, it means that you have less capability to pay, right?
Mm.
So it's more targeted in the sense that we're looking for poorer Black families, and those are the people who will prioritize in giving reparations to. Although my personal take is we should just like forgive all student loan
Yeah.
debt.
Same. Actually, what's interesting is the third point is actually already being done by some universities. Like, you'd be surprised. Like, a lot of them are actually like giving free tuition to descendants of enslaved Black Americans. So universities including Georgetown and Princeton Theological Seminary, which is, it's Princeton's theological branch. It's the second oldest seminary in the country. They're aiming to atone for the fact that they used slaves to build up their universities and allowed them to be the elite institutions that they are today, right? So descendants of the slaves sold by Georgetown and Princeton Theological Seminary are now entitled to full rights and benefits bestowed by those universities to obtain like degrees in whatever course they want. So it's amazing. Like, that's a step in the right direction. Like, some people would argue it's tokenistic, but I think like individual lives are actually being benefited from it, and we should take what we can. Sure, it's tokenistic. We can do more, but we shouldn't, like turn this down because it's already a good bargain to some degree. Like, we can ask for more, but we should not turn this away just because it's not exactly what they want, right? And the Virginia
Yeah,
state legislators actually are voting to apply this to their entire state. So that's also something we can look forward to. I don't know the progress there. The website hasn't been updated in a while, but I do think that the fact that it's being discussed by the legislator is already a good thing.
yeah. I was actually going to mention, since you were talking about universities, I wanted to mention the University of Tuskegee because since the theme for this year's Black History Month is Black health and Black wellness, it's very important for us to remember the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So the Tuskegee syphilis experiment started in 1932. And what happened there was the U.S. Public Health Service and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they wanted to study the effects of untreated syphilis. So the U.S. government and the University of Tuskegee, what they did was they got around 600 poor Black people, 400 of which had syphilis, to get them to sign up. They were told that they would get free medical care, which they actually did get for almost everything except for syphilis. So if they were feeling syphilis symptoms, they were like, nah, that's just your bad blood. And also, if they were feeling symptoms, they weren't given treatment for it. They were given placebos or ineffective methods and stuff like that. In fact, for many of them, they died and they never knew or they were never informed of their diagnosis that they had syphilis. So it continued for 40 years, and it would have continued for even more years if it weren't for a leak to the press in 1972. And as a result of that, 28 people died directly from syphilis, 100 people died from related complications, 40% of their spouses were infected, 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. So if there's any university that should give like compensation, I think it should be like the University of Tuskegee. And I just looked it up. Apparently, they're not doing much of like forgiving student loan debt. But they did create a Tuskegee Legacy Committee in 1996 that was basically trying to persuade President Bill Clinton to apologize on behalf of the government and to develop a strategy to address the damages of the study to the morale, the psyche of African Americans about this government led research. So I am actually looking at tuskegee.edu. There is nothing here about forgiving student loan debt. There's nothing here about reparations. Mostly what they're doing is they're asking other people in the government to fix the situation. I suppose like this entire page where they're just talking about the study is a form of symbolic reparation in terms of recognition for a past wrong. But it seems like they're actively like passing the buck to other actors like the public health service or just the federal government, stuff like that.
Yeah, like I think like given that it's also Health and Wellness Month, I mean that's the focus for this Black History Month. I think we should also look at how they're being treated generally by the healthcare system. So it's not just about syphilis. A lot of like for example, like as a woman, like I've read a lot about how OB-GYNs are like very white centric, right? Like the fact that there was a trending post on Twitter a few weeks back about the first photo of anatomy that uses like a black individual or a black woman. That was like revolutionary, and it just occurred to me like, yeah, I've never seen like in biology books black anatomy. It's always white individuals. Like, why is that? Why are we so afraid of talking about the human body and the differences that might exist and the treatments that might be different for like black individuals and white individuals and how they might be at a disadvantage because of the color of their skin? So those are things that need to be discussed, not just in the past but even now. Like a lot of our healthcare is very uh it's not just about being American. It's just about being white and pale. Like even the Philippines, right? There's a preferential treatment for if you're fairer skinned, especially if you go to the doctor. Like they will, like when I went to a what do you call the skin doctor? Sorry, I'm blanking.
Dermatologist.
Yeah, when I went to a dermatologist, right? Like she's one of the best in their field. Like I went to one of the more known ones because I was breaking out because of hormones and stuff like that. And I was asked, like, do you want skin whitening? And I was like, what? And like they're like, yeah, we'll give you skin whitening because you're pretty morena. And I was like, oh my God, why do you hate my skin so much?
You're you're not even like
Yeah, I'm not even that morena, right? But they were like, you could be whiter. Why don't you want to be whiter? And I was like, oh my God. I never returned. I got like my first dose of treatments, like and like I had to take oral medicine and like some toner on my face. But I never continued because I was so scared that what if they just without my consent gave me toner that was meant to whiten my skin without, me knowing. Or the
yeah.
pills
So
even. Like
I
yeah.
actually do know some people. We have some mutual friends that are just like boycotting skin whitening products, as well as skincare products that have microplastics in them because that's bad for
Yeah.
marine life.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of unethical practices, no, or at least like damaging practices in the skincare or the beauty industry in general.
Yeah, we can make an entire episode about that because I have a lot of thoughts as like a woman who has to live through that. But like, imagine if you're a black individual having to go through that kind of microaggression on the daily, like being told that you'd be prettier if you were white, being told that I'm gonna treat you differently because there is different. I'm gonna treat you differently just because of the color of your skin. Like those things are brutal to hear on a daily basis, and like I feel like there should be a form of reparation for that as well. Like I didn't find any, but if we were like debating this, Kyle, and we were to conjure something up, what would that kind of reparation be?
Um, I don't know, probably um like affirmative action sa mga models.
Or no, not just that. Like in the medical field, like being treated differently because of the
Oh,
color of your
I
skin.
thought I
Not
thought
beauty industry. Not beauty industry.
beauty industry. Like we did have a motion in a previous tournament. It was debatable intervarsity, I think, with Dr. RJ when we were talking about in the academe, let's subsidize or let's give research grants to more people of color. So maybe you can have like a quota there.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good way to do it. But like number 4 in the actual list that I found of ways that the black community would like to be given compensation, I guess, or like the form of reparations they would like to see. One of them is about housing, like down payment grants and housing revitalization grants for descendants of enslaved Black Americans. So you said this already earlier, right? That they had to be forced out of different communities, like they had to form ghettos. Um, so down payment grants will provide Black Americans with some initial equity, I guess, in their homes relative to mortgage insurance loans. And I guess like what would happen here is they're not asking to be moved, right, to better communities, or they're not asking white communities to adjust. They're just asking like you help us develop our own communities into, something at par with the white communities and the white neighborhoods that like a lot of people prefer, right? So I think this is fair as well. Again, a lot of people find this controversial because they're just like, why don't you just move out? But I guess, that's besides the point. The problem isn't that they can't move out, it's that they shouldn't need to move out anyway.
Yeah, I think the link there is quite clear, no? That there is a history of racial segregation in terms of housing. So we need to be able to repair that. And that might be in the form of mortgages, especially since like there is no such thing as like a depreciating land value, right? So the thing about land is the price of it always increases. And that's the reason why a lot of people think it's a solid investment. So it would really make sense if you help Black individuals or Black families deal with their mortgages as well. So I'm really G for that. I'm not the person who will benefit for. I'm not the one who's going to set the wheels in motion, but it makes sense to me. Like whenever I think about these kinds of motions, I feel like there always needs to be a link between the solution that you want to give and the harm that you want to address. So I can sort of understand why people would like feel weirded out by the forgiveness of student loans as a form of reparations. I can probably see why some less informed people would take exception to that because we all have student loans. Why don't we all get forgiven? The first response that I have there is like, yeah, you're right. We should all have student loans forgiven. But also, you need to take into consideration the context. Like, they're probably able to go there in spite of their family suffering through slavery. But still, they would have had an easier time if they didn't go through these things. So, in order to remedy that, we need to be able to subsidize their student loan debt. Although I still feel like you can actually argue this, I think, reasonably say that you're removing the focus away from how predatory educational institutions are in general. Because like student loans are hugely inflated talaga. And like this happens with or without slavery. Because I would think that even white people are victimized by just how much student loans there are, and it's not their fault. It's actually the fault of for-profit educational institutions. In fact, there's like recent news about how a lot of these big Ivy League schools are sort of colluding and doing price fixing, which is a very anti-competitive sort of thing, by looking into the capabilities of people to pay. So they are doing like really messed up stuff. And that is, I think, a reason why you shouldn't forgive these educational institutions just by making them subsidize student loans of Black people. I think like the whole system needs to be reassessed. So I think that you can oppose it on that ground. Like it's too narrow of a thing to do.
Yeah, but for me, like you can do that first while we're aiming to abolish, right? Like it doesn't take away, like you can have both at the same time. I feel like you can forgive their student loans, like start with them, and then once everyone's like, hey, this worked out, we should cancel everyone's student loans. Like that's a, like I think if anything, it's symbolic if they're the first ones to be given this kind of forgiveness in terms of student loans, right?
That's fair. Although I think that the debate then would be, is
like
that even true?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's even true. Like, how much political capital are you losing by focusing on them instead of reassessing the whole system?
Yeah, but if you wanna use the characterization of petty Americans, right? Like, hey, the black community has this. I want this for myself too. They might, might actually do the right thing and lean left just because the black community got something out of it. But that's like they're gonna you give a benefit to the black community. The white community gets so jealous they do it for themselves. Problem solved for everyone. Happy, happy. Like
Happy,
I
happy.
I feel like that's the best way to go about it. But that's just me and my disillusioned thoughts on, the American political system because they are going in flames. I mean, similar to the Philippines, I'm not speaking from a place of ascendancy. I'm speaking from a place of empathy. But the fifth one, actually for me, this is I see the link, but I saw a lot of people in the comment section of this page like going against this one. It's business grants for black communities. Like for them to start their own businesses, to obtain capital, especially since banks don't usually lend them capital. Like a lot of people would say, like Ben Shapiro would probably say, like, oh, that's because of your like credit score or whatever. But again, right, I see the connection. Like because you were from a poor household, because you are a descendant of slaves, you weren't able to build that good capital to obtain the ability to start your own business. But some people think it's overkill. Like, why do they need to start businesses in the first place? So for me, I guess as a millennial, I see the essentiality of like start being able to obtain capital for a business, being able to set up your own thing, not being enslaved to another corporation. Like I feel like that's symbolic empowerment, right? Especially for a black individual. But I can also see why others would think it's overkill.
Yeah, I understand that. Maybe it's not overkill so much as like my comment from the previous point. It might be something that's too narrow when we should be looking at some greater thing. Like I think that it should be easy for people to set up businesses, right? Like there
Mm,
shouldn't be like much barriers to entry for any person, right? So I think you can relate that to motions about, for example, the Democrat Party. Should they focus more on economic issues rather than identity politics, whatever that means? Because like you can see that a lot of these issues based on racial lines, they have an effect on their economic standing as well, and they're not alone in that disadvantageous economic position. So the argument there is like if we focus on the general thing more, we have more support to make that reform, and as a result of that, the black community will also be benefited. But we have to like be nuanced here as well, like, and it
mm.
would depend on what the motion is about or what the topic is about, because there are some experiences that are unique to people of color as well. So Mickey Kendall, which I mentioned before, in their book Hood Feminism, they were talking about how, like, historically in the feminist movement, black people were being excluded from the narrative because of that argument that if the entire feminist movement wins, black women also win. But as a result, there are some parts of the experience of black women that is just forgotten. So I think that those kinds of things might be debatable, not in the sense that we shouldn't have it at all, but in the sense that should we prioritize these people, or should we look at a more general sort of forgiveness of student loans, or a more general assistance to smaller businesses?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But basically, those are the five requests of the Black community. Of course, there are more. There are more specific ones, but these are the ones that from different like fields of study of Black communities. These seem to be the five that a lot of them coincide with. Um, of course, if you find out more and you want to advocate for more, that's completely up to you, right? But again, we're not in the position to say what they should be asking for or clamoring for. I'm just a mere vessel of like I'm a medium right now and communicating through my particular channel what the Black community is advocating for and what they want. But I think that if you can especially if you're on Spotify right now, like search for different Black content creators that might be making content on Black History Month as well. I think you'd find a lot of insight, a lot of their personal stories, and you can get a lot more information from firsthand knowledge of the struggles that they're going through, as well as what they want for themselves. So yeah, that was like our discussion on reparations. Again, how to make arguments on reparations takes 3 steps. Talking about the historical wrong, that's step 1. Talking about the ongoing harm, that's step 2. And talking about the reparative actions, that's step 3. Of course, this can apply to other groups like feminist movements or the LGBT movement, or people who have been colonized before, or people who were victims of imperialism. Again, though, we wanted to make the example specifically nuanced to the Black community, given the symbolism of this month, and given that, with what's happening right now in the United States, they do deserve the spotlight for these particular issues.
Yeah, I think mm, whenever you're talking about historical reparations, right, you always need to take a look at the context in which you're arguing, because historical reparations are essentially all about the interests of those people. So I feel like, especially for these motions, you shouldn't think of debating as just like something that you do or something that you want to win in, because it's really a big disservice to people who are actually affected by these issues. So you need to be extra empathetic in these situations. So I suppose that whenever you're talking about historical reparations, you wanna make sure that you're being authentic, and like you can't. There's a limit to how authentic that you can be, right? Like I'm not asking you to like change your race or something. Like I identify as this race, because that's pretty offensive most of the time.
I mean, that's that. Some people would say that's debatable, but I think it's straight up offensive. But to each their own, I guess.
Yeah, but like you want to empathize, but at the same time you're not speaking over them. So if you are outside of the debate room and you're seeing these kinds of conversations happen, try to give it to the people of color, because actually Nina knows this, but I want to let everyone else know. There is a 2-part series on YouTube about Raya the Last Dragon, and it's just 4 hours of different people from Southeast Asia talking about the different problematic parts of Raya the Last Dragon and what Disney gets wrong in terms of representation. So I feel like this is a very needed project, because whenever we're talking about historical reparations, there's a tendency for people who are in places of privilege to talk over people of color. And they have their particular opinions, and they refuse to acknowledge the voices of people of color if those voices do not validate the opinions of those privileged people as well. So you can see this in, like, especially with Raya and the Last Dragon, there was a content creator, Lindsay Ellis, who compared it, narratively speaking, to Avatar and the Last Airbender. Avatar and the Last Airbender. Where did I get that? Avatar the Last Airbender. And people lost their minds because they're like, that's so racist. Why are you comparing them just because they're Asian? And a lot of Southeast Asian people were defending Lindsay Ellis, but no one wanted to listen to them because their voices or their opinions did not validate
The
our
wokeness.
need
Yeah.
for woke harassment. So you can see that there is some sort of like cancel culture there, right? So be as open-minded as possible. Like, you are not in a position to assert dominance over anyone else. And this also applies for like members of indigenous communities here in the Philippines. So there was a lot of discourse in the past about who victimizes indigenous peoples more. So there were some people from indigenous communities who were saying that it's the government that is victimizing us. There were also some people from indigenous communities who are saying that terrorist organizations are the ones who are oppressing us. And those people, the latter category, they were just being ignored, right? So we need to be as open-minded as possible, because like if there are conflicting narratives within that community, they should be the ones to resolve that. You can't go like I'm a privileged person and let me break the deadlock. You're not government whip for this community, right? You're an observer and you want to platform these people as well. So I guess that's it for this episode. Happy Black History Month. Let's all try to be more educated by the time that the month is over.
Yep. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.